Welcome to the Surviving Grief video podcast of Beyond Silence, Navigating Loss in the LGBTQ plus community. I'm Gary Sturgis, the creator and founder of Surviving Grief and the author of Surviving Grief 365 Days a Year. I'm so honored to be talking with Bobby Moss. Bobby is a gay widower and community leader in the LGBTQ plus community. After losing his husband of 7 months and partner of 30 years, in a motorcycle accident, Bobby found healing through connection, eventually becoming a leading voice on grief and loss in the LGBTQ plus community. Bobby has an active and engaging social media presence and is well known for his LGBTQ grief loss support page on Facebook. He facilitates peer support groups, speaks at national conferences, and works with organizations like Soaring International to expand resources for widowed individuals. Recently, Bobby remarried and shares his journey of loss, resilience, and rediscovering love, offering hope to those navigating life after profound grief. Bobby, thank you so much for joining me today.
Gary, thanks so much for having me.
It's so nice to meet you. Tell me about your grief journey up to this point and how you decided to create your LGBTQ grief loss support page on Facebook.
Sure. So, in 2017, I lost my husband Terry to a motorcycle accident. Actually, while we were traveling in Thailand, so I was on the other side of the world, away from family, away from friends, alone in a hospital, and had no idea what to do. A friend of mine reached out who knew someone who lost his husband the year before and had found a Facebook group, a private Facebook group, that had been very helpful to him connecting with other widowed people. And so I joined that group. I didn't start it. It was started by Neil Doe after he lost his husband and couldn't find local support. And so he turned to the internet to bring together a virtual community. So I was the 278th member of the group. Today there's about 3,600 that have been very involved with that since joining and became an admin. And the group has really grown since then. But for me, one of the things they taught me early on was that to move forward, because you can never move on from this, but to move forward, you needed to bring new people into your life, which was not helpful at day 6, which is when I heard that. But 6 months later, I really used that to start connecting with other people. And I traveled a fair amount for work. And so I would reach out to people on Facebook to say, hey, I'm going to be in your city. Would you be interested in grabbing coffee? And so in that first year, I wound up meeting about 16 or 18 people sort of organically as I traveled around. And each time I spent time with widowed people, those 3 hours were more healing to me than hours talking to family and friends. And so it really sort of fueled a passion to connect. And I think since that time, over the last 8 years, I've really tried to expand that community and find other ways to continue growing those connections.
Yeah, that's great. So, what do you think are some of the most significant ways that grief is different for LGBTQ plus individuals compared to the general population?
I think at the end of the day, love is love, and grief is grief. I think every loss is difficult and unique. I do think that our community faces some things that are unique to us, largely around acceptance, societal acceptance, familial acceptance. Um, for me, my partner was not out to his family. It was a don't ask, don't tell, good Southern Baptist family. So we were together for 30 years. They clearly knew that we were a couple, but he did not tell his parents until it became legal for us to get married. And so after 29 years, he finally told his parents that, in fact, we were a couple and that we were getting married, and he couldn't do that without telling them. And their response was, well, now you've told us, we don't need to talk about that. And so for me, after losing Terry, having to manage this odd situation, which suddenly they wanted to completely talk about Terry and my relationship and acknowledge how meaningful it was and that I had lost my person. And it outraged me because I felt like you couldn't give Terry the unconditional love while he was here. But now you're feeling it. And I think it was very hard on them recognizing that they had live this sort of artificial relationship with them. Other ways, there's a lot of legal protections I think that we're lacking because marriage equality, even though we feel like we can take it for granted now that it's been 10 years almost to the day since it's become the law of the land, it's still relatively new. And a lot of people, have don't feel like it's necessary, or they, for a long time, they were excluded from it. So the long-term couples may not feel like they want to take that step. And as a result, they may not be protected. I have a friend who had to buy the other half of his own home that he had paid off from his partner's family or from his children. And that was, essentially all of his life insurance money went to them because of that situation. And so many people, Terry died without a will. We never expected at 47, we weren't really thinking about it. And so I was incredibly fortunate that we had been married, because if we hadn't, I think his family would have come shopping at our house to figure out what they wanted to take. So I think legally there's a lot of differences that if people didn't take the protections or weren't able to get married, that comes up a lot. I think the other thing is just when you're in that vulnerable position, you fear being judged. And so for me, I turned to an online community because I didn't want local bereavement, because a lot of local bereavement I found was in churches or were religious based, and those were not areas that I had felt welcomed in my life, and so they weren't places that I felt comfortable turning to. And I heard others express their experience. Some had wonderful experiences and others had horrifying experiences in those settings.
Yeah, and it's interesting you said that because I met a gentleman who was in a nursing facility and he had been with his partner. I don't remember whether they were married or not, but like for 40 years, and he said that when he went into the nursing facility, there was no grief support and he felt like he had to go back in the closet again. He was afraid to tell these people in the nursing facility that he was gay, and I just remember feeling so sorry for him, that he was grieving and doing this alone, and then feeling that he couldn't be his genuine self and he couldn't talk about his partner who he was with for so long, and so it's really difficult. So what do you think are the most common barriers that LGBTQ plus people face when they're seeking bereavement support?
I think one of the biggest barriers is probably local support. It's shocking to me how few resources specific to the LGBTQ community are really out there. You can find them online. It's a little bit easier. Life has gotten a little better with Zoom, which again is still a fairly recent thing.
Mm,
But I think one, access to queer support is can be challenging for folks if they don't live near an urban center, which a lot of gay people do not. I think the other is just financial resources, because when you lose your person, you may not have or may have not had life insurance. You suddenly have lost half of your income in your family, and so hiring grief counselors and others can be pricey. And so I think resources are a barrier, and just the existence of that support, I think, is a little bit harder to find.
yeah, that's true. So how does the fear of stigma or discrimination influence whether LGBTQ plus individuals reach out for help during times of loss?
I think, yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a couple of different ways, and that I've seen and that close friends of mine have experienced. One is I'm surprised at how many widows and widowers, gay or lesbian widows and widowers, are out of the closet. A lot of people move out to rural areas and their world is fairly small and they have each other, and that's all they want. They just build this world around themselves. And when they lose their person, they may not have been out to their neighbors. They may not have been out to coworkers. And so when they lose them, their community is like, we're so sorry you lost your friend, and they don't recognize the importance of that loss because they may not have allowed them to see it. And so they wind up suffering almost in silence because the community's not aware. So I think that becomes a big challenge. The other, I have a friend who went to a local bereavement group, and she told everyone she had lost her wife to cancer. They've been together for 20 something years. And the next lady introduced herself, talked about losing her husband. And the third lady said, "I'm so glad you're here and that someone else here can understand my loss." Immediately discounting my friend's loss and making it less than, which was devastating to her. So at the lowest point in her life, she was, her worst fear was realized that her loss was not treated as equal to others. And so I think that's a real stigma. And I think that's a real fear that people have. Kind of as I mentioned, I think a lot of times, a lot of the bereavement support that's in community is offered by churches and by sort of community infrastructure. And so our community has had a complicated relationship with religion. And so I think that it sort of plays into that. And like I said, I think the other is just people don't always recognize the relationship as equal to a heterosexual relationship.
Right. And it's interesting because I facilitate bereavement support groups, and in one of my groups it was all women, who had lost their husband, and there was one woman in the group who had lost her wife, and she was with her for quite a long time. And I always tell the group members, if you have any questions or concerns, during the week before we meet again, please feel free to email me. Well, that night after the first group, she had sent me an email and she said, Gary, I really appreciate you facilitating this group and everything, but she said, I don't think I'm going to come back. And I said, why? And she said, well, because I feel uncomfortable. When I said my wife, like some people kind of looked like, they weren't too happy about that, and I said, no, 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 like, please, please, please come back, and she did, but I think for the whole entire, it was a 6 week session. I think for that whole entire 6 weeks, she never did feel comfortable talking, and whether the other people, had an issue with it or not, I don't know. But just the fact that she felt so disengaged from the mainstream population in that group was a little concerning, and I felt
Yeah.
really bad for her. And so I facilitate a group for LGBTQ plus people specifically, and I've often had people say to me like, "Well, why do you do that? Like their grief is just like everybody else." And it's like, quite frankly, it's not. It's unique in many different ways. A lot of LGBTQ plus people don't have children, and so I know when my dad died, I'm now taking care of my mom, and she feels comfortable and safe with that. A lot of LGBTQ plus people do not have that. They know that when this person died, that's their only person, and they may be estranged from their family because of their lifestyle, and they may not have children, and so they become very alone. And I think what happened to this particular woman was she said, they keep talking about how happy they are that they have their children to support them. And she said, I don't have that. And so she said, in a lot of ways, that's not helping me. It's making me feel worse, and
Yeah.
I could understand that, so I can see how that can happen. But so how do issues of family acceptance or even lack thereof complicate the grieving process for LGBTQ individuals?
I think that, usually society sort of has structures in place to handle death. There's rituals, there's, the viewing where family and friends can come, and it's all sort of set up to try to comfort the person who has lost their spouse. And society kind of understands that, and neighbors come, and people bring food for days, and there's all of these rituals to support the person. And I think for some LGBTQ people that happens. I think for many that doesn't happen. And if there is estrangement in the family, or if there was tolerance in the family but never acceptance, then when something happens, people tend to go away. My younger brother, actually someone told me, and I thought I had found it to be true, that any kind of tragedy or emergency in your life will amplify the nature of the relationships around you. And so if there's sort of a natural tendency to pull towards each other, they'll show up and it'll pull them closer. If there's fractures, those relationships can shatter. And so with my younger brother, that was very much the case. We had always had, a up and down relationship, and he had always been outwardly loving and supportive of my partner. But when Terry died, we had one phone conversation, and he didn't come to the service, and He just disappeared. And so for years, I'm just like, okay, if you can't be here for me now, then I don't need you. And so I think that, the reality of what those relationships are come to surface, and sometimes in really awful ways. And so I think that, family is always can be lovely and can be challenging. Um, and I think that's true too in the heterosexual world. I don't think that's unique to the gay community, but I think it's far more prevalent in our community. And like I said, shared, my husband's family, it was very Southern Baptist, and it was very much kept under the blankets. We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to ask you about that. We don't want to know about that. And therefore, I couldn't be there to support his parents after his death, and they certainly weren't there to support me.
So, in your experience, what are the most urgent changes needed in bereavement services to make them more inclusive and affirming for LGBTQ plus grievers?
I think that's and I'll give an organization, Soaring Spirits, great credit for this. I think they need to be explicit about welcoming everyone. And I think that, language matters a lot, visibility matters a lot. And so I think when organizations intentionally are inclusive and outwardly inclusive and show up in a way that welcomes everyone, it makes people feel very comfortable more quickly. Like yourself, I host some additional support groups. One of them was for newly widowed people. And in the newly widowed people, there's usually 40 to 50 people on those calls. And we have, range of speakers. And we often have two or three people who have lost a same-sex partner in those calls. And I think one of the things that one, they're intentional about saying all loss is welcome here, all widows. And, marriage did not define your relationship. We're not, we don't just define widowhood by you lost your legal spouse. We define it by you lost the person you thought you would spend the rest of your life with. And so in using language like that, and I always put my pronouns in my name when I'm hosting those calls, so that opening the door for people to show up how they want to show up. I think it's those little signs that make people feel more comfortable. And being a gay man and hosting that call, I think that also helps when I'm one of the facilitators, because I speak very openly about losing my husband. So I think being intentional about it is good, and making people feel welcome, because a lot of the local bereavement, I don't feel welcome because I'm not explicitly invited. And I think being gay, I want to be exclusively or explicitly invited. I want to see a rainbow flag, or I want to see something that says, we are inclusive. And oftentimes that's missing. So I'm going to assume that that's not a place that I'm welcome, especially when I'm feeling so vulnerable after such a loss.
Yeah. So, what have you learned from working with LGBTQ plus individuals and communities about finding healing in the aftermath of loss?
I think a couple of things. Early on, people would tell me that it would get better, time helps, all of those kind of things. And I don't tell anybody that. All I tell them is it won't always feel like it does today. And in time, it won't be so raw, because that's all I can promise them, because everybody's loss is so different. There's a lovely member of our group, Dana, who posted one day something that just really resonated, actually made me cry, and I may cry even saying it. She said, I came to this group to learn about grief, but what I've learned about really is love. And I think that that's the biggest thing I've learned, is that grief is love. And I will grieve Terry for the rest of my life, because I will love Terry for the rest of my life. And I will love Tim, who's my new husband. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. And so I think, what I've learned is that grief will endure, but it does because of the love, and that love is love. And so it's all, it all should be respected and honored. And it's not something you get past, but it's something that you can certainly learn to carry.
Yeah, and I agree. People ask me all the time, what will this get better, and I always say to them, it doesn't ever really get better. It just gets softer. And I always tell them to kind of hold on to the thought that you will remember this person that you lost with more love than pain as time goes on. And I really do believe, from my own standpoint and my own loss, that that's what really happened. When people ask me, like, geez, you seem like you're doing so good. Well, yeah, I am. Life goes on. But I always say, I think what I've done is I now remember this person that I loved and lost with more love than I do with pain. When I think of them, I try to think of the happy memories and the goodness of it instead of just the pain. And I know that's really difficult, especially, for someone like me who watched the person suffer or were a caregiver for that person, or even someone that had a sudden loss. It's traumatic. And so it takes a long time to get over that trauma. But I think that in time, that's what happens. It doesn't get better, it gets different, it gets softer, and we just remember them more with love than with pain, you know?
Beautifully said. And I'll say for me, that was around the third year mark. Sometime in the third year, I realized that when I thought of Terry, I smiled because I remembered all the love and all the wonderful things. Whereas before that, all I could do was cry because he wasn't here. Like I
Mhm.
couldn't see past his absence until about 3 years in. And that was a lovely, lovely place to get
Mhm.
because those are the things I want to remember and those are the feelings I want to recapture.
Right. And it's such a long, hard road to that point, and that's why I do what I do. That's why
Yeah.
I want to support these people because I will never forget, even though I've healed and I've moved forward in my life, I will never forget what those first years were like, and I think that's why I do what I do. It's important for me. So what gives you hope about the future of grief support for LGBTQ plus people?
I think that I have seen more of it. I've seen it be more visible. This August, we're returning to LA LGBT Center for a Camp Widow event, which we did 5 years ago, and then the pandemic kind of shut everything down. But that's going to become an annual event in LA, New York, probably Chicago, to create a space for LGBTQ widowed people to come together. And I think that is very exciting to me. So I think that as organizations realize the need and the gap in support, I think they're trying to step up to fill that. So I'm very hopeful for that. And also just, technology and other things that allow us to connect and allow people to come together. I think this is one of the positives of social media. There's many downsides, but this has been an amazing island of support and hope. And so I think those things will continue to grow, and that gives me a lot of hope. And like yourself, I think for me personally, giving back and showing up and offering support is part of how I continue my healing. And the reward for that is I get to watch people who lost their person last week or last month and see where they are and see how they can't imagine life going further. Um, and then I get to see them 2 years later, still coming to the calls, but now they're dating somebody. And then a year or two later, I'm flying to Portugal to officiate their wedding. Like those are the kind of experiences that make all of this worth it for me because I always leave those support calls feeling better because I just see everybody helping each other, and for me that brings a lot of hope and a lot of healing for myself. And as those people kind of mature in their grief, they're wanting to reach back and provide a hand to others. And I think that helps us grow the network over time. So I'm very hopeful with what the next few years will bring. And at some point, I will take a step back and I'll let a new cohort of folks kind of carry it forward.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's so true. I find so much, people ask me, how can you do this work? You're around sadness and sorrow so much, and I always say, there's nothing that brings me more joy than having a person in my support group that's just lost a partner or spouse say, I will never ever love anyone again. nobody can replace this person I loved, and it will just never happen. And I don't care what anyone says. And then, a couple of years later, they call me and say, "Oh my God, Gary, I'm so happy I met this wonderful person." And, and I always say, I love that, because I love the fact that this person who really was, dead set, never ever, ends up finding this love again in their life and this healing in their life. And like you said, it brings me joy when that happens. And I, much like you, am in the process now of kind of training people who were in my groups to now facilitate the groups and kind of carry the torch for me, because I've been doing it for so long, and it did heal my heart, doing that. And so I want them to have that opportunity too, so sometimes, I feel the same way you do. We have to step aside and kind of pass the torch on to somebody that's behind us. So if you could change one thing about how society understands or responds to LGBTQ plus grief, what would that be?
I think just respect it, understand that it's all about love, and that love is love. That there is no difference, and that someone who lost, a man who lost a husband is no less painful than a man who lost his wife. And I'll honestly say, in some ways, in some cases, I think it's even harder, because in many cases they were each other's person in a way that may not happen in other cases. The love is incredibly deep, and I've witnessed so much pain in people that it shocks me when anyone can believe otherwise. So I think respect and understanding that our loss is just as deep and meaningful and difficult and hard and ongoing as any other loss would be.
Yeah. So before I end, I want to ask you to just tell me a little bit about Soaring Spirits International. Like how, what does that offer? How can people get involved? Just tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Soaring Spirits was founded about 16 years ago when by a lady, Michelle Neff Hernandez, who lost her husband to a bicycle accident. And she was a young widow with kids and wasn't finding the support she needed. And she started interviewing and talking to other widowed people, and found that what she was missing was this sense of community. And so 15, 13 years ago, she started a Camp Widow, which was essentially a conference for widowed people, to bring widowed people together and give them social, psychoeducational, sessions and workshops and other things. And it has grown since. It's now there's one this weekend actually in Toronto, Canada. That will be a weekend long camp, but they're this year going to 4 different cities plus LA as a 1 day experience. But it's an opportunity for widowed people to come together. All the sessions are led by widowed people. And it's really incredible. And they have other resources. You can go to widowedvillage.com or I'm sorry, widowvillage.org. Is their site with lots of resources for newly widowed people, region social groups. I facilitate an LGBTQ virtual social group through Widowed Village, that we meet every Thursday and 2 Saturdays a month. So lots of opportunities for people to connect. But I found when I first found them, I had hosted about 32 people from the Facebook group in Atlanta in 2018. And I organized it. It was an incredible weekend at a local hotel. People flew in from the UK and across the country. And when it was done, everyone said, "Can we do this every year?" And I said, "Absolutely not, because I can't do this by myself every year. But there's this amazing organization that does Camp Widow. Why don't we go? Why don't we start, kind of partnering with them and build an LGBTQ track within Camp Widow?" And now that's really become a separate camp just for LGBT people at an LGBT center. So that's what they do. They help millions of widowed people around the world. All are welcome, which is a big part of why I've got involved with them. But for me, it's trying to connect my community of 3,600 people on Facebook to an in-person experience where they can come together and people can meet each other and spend time together. And that is my vision. I'm really hoping that, people will come and that we will continue to expand it and continue just growing the network of support.
So Soaring Spirits International and Camp Widow are not exclusively for LGBTQ plus people.
They are not. Soaring Spirits is a global organization that helps all widow people. What When I got involved, I really wanted to help them expand service to the LGBTQ community, and so they have been over the last 5 years. We've worked together to expand that, and up to starting a virtual group 4 years ago, and they held a. I got involved with them during the first camp at the LGBT Center. That was their first 1 day experience. Nate Burkus was the keynote speaker. It was just an amazing, amazing conference. And so I met Michelle at that, and we started talking because at the time I had 1,800 widowed people. And I wanted to find a way for them to take advantage of Camp Widow and all the organization and all of the logistics and contracts and all of that stuff that they deal with, and let us come in and take advantage of that and give back and host sessions and create content relevant to our community within that framework.
That's wonderful. I'm going to include the link for Soaring Spirits International and Camp Widow in the comment section of this video. But thank you so much, Bobby, for talking so openly about your experience and providing the much needed support and resources for this unique community within the field of grief and loss.
Gary, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about it. It's a subject I'm passionate about, and I look forward to meeting you in person one day. Come
Yeah.
to camp. Join us there.
I would very much enjoy that. So if you or someone you love would like to join Bobby's LGBTQ plus grief loss support page on Facebook, I'll include the link in the comment section of this video. And remember, when it comes to the grief and the loss of a loved one, we're all just walking each other home.